Cleopatra was able to rule Egypt.
我们第二个演讲员他的话题关于是埃及艳后的这个人。
Today we have been seeing in the news, well, for the last 2-3 days, what's going on in Egypt right now. All the turmoil, which is part of the liberty, part of the freedom, whatever you're going to call to the right, to the left, or the center. But I think Mike is going to inform us about why Cleopatra was able to rule Egypt. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael.
Because we don't have our usual evaluator, I'm just going to remind all of you that you are the evaluators. You see. So his speech today is from the manual speech to inform. He has also asked us to notice how well he uses the PowerPoint presentation today. He is actually using it to slow himself down because in general he speaks too quickly. So in this club, we realize where our strong points are, and we work on that. 今天他希望他演讲不会太快，所以他用这个做工具。So 现在可以欢迎 Michael Nestor his speech How Cleopatra was able to rule Egypt. 那详细地方。
How many of you have followed the news today? No? Yeah, you, Robert? Egypt, as Alberto was talking about, has been having massive protests. This is in Cairo's capital, in Tahrir Square. They're protesting the president. Next slide. His name is Mohamed Morsi. Anyway, the nature of the protest isn't important. The fact that they're protesting his presidency has been an issue, and the army has been threatening a coup. Next slide. Al-Sisi is behind a coup. He overthrew Morsi today. Next slide. This isn't the first time that has happened. The army's overthrown the previous president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. Next slide. Egypt has had a long history of problems. Anybody know who this man is? Anwar Sadat. In 1979, our president, Jimmy Carter, forged a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. What was the consequence of that? Next slide. In 1981, the Egyptians assassinated Sadat. Next slide. Talking about freedom, we're going to Cleopatra. How many of you know who Cleopatra is? It's okay if you don't. Okay, so almost everybody here does. She was the queen of Egypt, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of Cleopatra and how she got there, and then how she was able to maintain her power. It's actually very impressive, given the fact that she ruled over 2,000 years ago. She was a woman. She was a foreigner. She was a Greek ruling an Egyptian country. And at that time, there were even more coups and assassinations and revolutions than there are in Egypt now. Next slide, please. We have to start with 323 BC. Alexander the Great conquered most of the then-known world. Next slide. Which in Eurocentric terms is basically the eastern part of Europe and all the way down to India. The part we're going to focus on today is Cyprus, Libya, and Egypt, and mostly Egypt. Next slide. When Alexander died in 323, he didn't leave a will, so his empire was divided up amongst his generals. One of the generals shown here is Ptolemy I. He was one of the smarter ones. He decided to take over Egypt because Egypt had a lot of natural resources and a lot of wealth. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which he founded, lasted about 300 years. Next slide. And Cleopatra was born around 69 or 70 BC to Ptolemy XII. She had two sisters. She had a brother and a sister who were younger than she. The father decided that Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII, would rule Egypt. Rome controlled Egypt at the time. It was a subsidiary, kind of like California is a part of the United States, so there was a certain level of autonomy. Probably best described as the relationship between Hong Kong now and China. There was a problem, though. Cleopatra was a peacemaker. She wanted peace with Rome. She wanted to get along. Their army was much stronger than Egypt. They had no chance fighting them. Her brother and sister opposed her and called her a traitor and said, no, we need to get militant. We need to have a revolution. We need to get these Romans off of our backs. And they exiled her. Next slide. This is her sister Arsinoe IV, who had her deposed and exiled to Syria. Well, Cleopatra wasn't happy with that. She formed an army, and next slide, decided to come back to Egypt. She also had Julius Caesar get involved. He had the will and went to Egypt to enforce it. How many of you know who Julius Caesar is? Most of you. Next slide. He is the salad guy. Next slide. He's also the founder of Little Caesar's Pizza. He's not so nice a character. He went to Egypt and told Arsinoe she could be the leader of Cyprus. But Arsinoe said no, and she got into a fight with him, and he basically exiled her. And Ptolemy XIII was killed in fighting Caesar. Therefore, Cleopatra was able to rule Egypt. Next slide. But she really didn't like Arsinoe, and she was afraid that Arsinoe would come back and get her. So next slide. So what she did, next slide, was she involved Mark Antony. Next slide. And this is not Mark Antony, the singer. Next slide. Who went out with J-Lo. Next slide. Cleopatra actually enlisted Mark Antony and had Arsinoe killed. Therefore, Cleopatra had absolute power. But there are several other things that Cleopatra did to maintain her power. First of all, she had relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, so she solidified the relationship with Rome. In terms of Greece, she had coins minted in her image. Next slide. As we talked about the relationship with Caesar and Mark Antony. Next slide. In the coins, it showed her more as a Greek. If you notice, she had a long nose, she had a shortened chin, and she had an enlarged neck. These are typical Greek features. She also had coins minted in for the Romans, and they also had her depicted as this. This looks more like a Greek woman, especially the hairdo, than an Egyptian woman. Next slide. So what's in the name? Cleopatra. Her full name is Cleopatra VII Philopater. She's actually of Greek origin, and she's from the Ptolemy dynasty. Her first name, Kleos Pater, means glory of the father. She was daddy's little girl. She was the 7th Cleopatra in the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Philopater means she loved her country, or she was a patriot. She took really good care of her subjects. There was a drought at one point. She taxed the rich and transferred the money over to the poor so that they could have food to eat. Next slide. She also did lots of other things that were very, very intelligent politically. She represented herself as the incarnation of the goddess Isis. She had herself put on temple walls, and she built temples and monuments to herself, much like the Greek pharaohs of old did. So she impressed upon herself as being more Egyptian than Greek. She also did one thing that none of the other Ptolemies ever did. She learned Egyptian. She could converse in more than 9 languages, including Egyptian, so she was able to talk with the natives and deal with court situations in their language. So the people really endeared her. Next slide. So in summary, these are some of the challenges that Cleopatra had. She was a woman in a man's world. Egypt was a colony of the Roman Empire, and assassinations and coups were the norm at the time. Caesar, Cassius, Brutus, and Caligula were all examples of Roman leaders who were assassinated. And Cleopatra actually had her sister assassinated as well. Cleopatra's triumph involved the fact that she played both sides. She had a relationship with Rome, literally, with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and she had coinage made in her image to create a propaganda campaign. Likewise, she assimilated with the Egyptians by taking on their religion, representing herself as the goddess Isis. She got involved in temple building. She also did some coinage, and her legacy lives on in coins. Next slide, please. And I have this coin here. This is a 50 piastre coin. This is current Egyptian mintage. And this is an image of Cleopatra as, of course, an Egyptian. The Egyptians still honor her to a certain extent. Next slide. We're hoping that people like the current military leader, Al-Sisi, will take into account the fact that Cleopatra was a leader of the people and that she endeared herself to the people and took care of her. And we can only hope that Egypt will follow this course in the future. Mr. Toastmaster.